guys hear me? Can you hear me?
What was one thing that you did in your job, your first few jobs, that you feel are today totally irrelevant?
I wish I could have told my younger self, careers are no longer linear, you will keep pivoting. So not really that important, just do your best.
Big things when you start off, you try and sound very smart, right? You try and speak a lot, you try and outdo everybody else in terms of smartness in the room. Actually, silence and listening are also fantastic ways to build presence. Over time, you realize actually that quality matters far more than quantity.
So values, purpose, culture. Jaya, what about you?
Early on I was in sales and I was doing really well. I was among the top 2-3 performers. So I was, of course, a little cocky about that. And I didn't realize that I was building great relationship with my clients, but I didn't see my internal clients. But I realized that networking and building internal relationships are very important.
When you're somebody who's just starting out or, is in a big organization, how does one exercise that?
So step number one, don't focus on problems, focus on finding the solution. Secondly, don't focus on organizational constraints, but how you can navigate it. The other things you can do is that you can take ownership. It could be in very small but meaningful ways. For example, you can own a process, right? You spot an inefficiency and you step up and suggest a solution. Don't wait for someone senior to do it.
Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Circle. I'm Jaya Mehrotra.
And I'm Gayatri Rangachari Shah. At Circle, we try to shine a light on thought leaders and luminaries to share their stories and learn from their experiences. In today's episode, we're going to deep dive into personal agency, the ability to act with intent, to make decisions with clarity, and to take ownership.
Today we are joined by very experienced leaders, Vivek Gambhir. He has a career spanning multiple decades across the globe. He's also the mentor and advisor to WLC. He's also a chairperson at Boat Ventures and venture partners at Lightspeed. Our second guest, Shalini Sekhri, has worked in financial services and wealth management and is currently an executive director of Renaissance Investment Managers. Both of them bring deep insights from the world of entrepreneurship, investing, and people management.
Vivek and Shalini, we're so glad to have you here. So I'd like to get us started with a quick question for actually all of you. What was one thing that you did in your job, your first few jobs, that you feel are today totally irrelevant? Or flip that question around, is there something that you never really paid attention to back then that you think is increasingly important today? Shalini, let's start with you.
So I think back at my very eager 23-year-old self starting my first job. And the one thing I thought about constantly is, where do I see myself 5 years from now? 10 years from now? I was convinced I needed the perfect plan and I would have to follow it to a T to succeed. 2 years later, living in a different city, in a different job, absolutely nothing as per plan. And I wish I could have told my younger self, careers are no longer linear, you will keep pivoting. So not really that important, just do your best. And conversely, when I think about something I absolutely put no thought into, but is so critical now, is that I didn't look at who are the people I'm going to work with. What is the culture of that organization? Mm-hmm. Does it align with my aspirations for myself, who I am as a person? And now when I look back at almost a 30-year career, I'm like, oh my God, that's the one thing that really decided whether or not I would succeed at any role that I took up. So just didn't think about it when I should have.
Right. Yeah. It's actually so true, right? This whole idea that most of us realize after some time that careers don't necessarily follow straight lines. And Gayatri, for me, I think the big thing is when you start off, you try and sound very smart, right? You try and speak a lot, you try and outdo everybody else in terms of smartness in the room, because you think that's the way to build presence. And I realized over time, actually, silence and listening are also fantastic ways to build presence, because we are in so much of an urge initially to speak a lot, but over time you realize actually that quality matters far more than quantity. In terms of, I think, things that now in hindsight probably feel a lot more relevant. When you're younger, you start chasing titles, you start chasing roles, right? And people talk about meaning and fulfillment, and you kind of dismiss the why. And now when you realize how important, whether it's you call it purpose or meaning it is, in some ways, I think thinking a lot more in the beginning itself can be very powerful in terms of being able to make the right choices in life.
So values, purpose, culture. Jaya, what about you?
Early on, I was in sales and I was doing really well. I was among the top 2-3 performers. So I was, of course, a little cocky about that. And I didn't realize that I was building great relationship with my clients, but I didn't see my internal clients. And I didn't think I need to build relationships internally in the organization because numbers were happening. I was getting the highest variable compensation. I thought I was doing a great job, but I realized that networking and building internal relationships are very important. And taking from what Vivek and Shalini said, one thing that I think I overthought about is at 30, I need to be AVP. I can only have my baby once I become an AVP. I like what? You think that's so irrelevant when you look back. My daughter's 20 now. I'm 50 and I'm again starting again. So really, some of these things we really overthink in those 2-3 year period. And I think it's not that relevant.
I resonate with everything all of you say, and I would just add to that. I think I think you touched upon a fulfillment, purpose. I think enjoyment. Really, like getting up in the morning, wanting to go to work or wanting to do what you're doing. I think that when you're younger, obviously, like the paycheck is important. You may not love what you're doing, but you need the job. I think over time, if you're sort of on the right path, and I think if you really have a work situation where you're excited to show up every day, I think that really helps to bring out the best in people. And I think that's something that we don't always think about because we're so busy chasing, financial security.
So our first segment is about agency, and we've discussed this a lot of time. How do we use the right word to describe action? And an agency can mean different things to different people. And to me, agency means how do you kind of look at your setbacks and failures and turn that into experience and insights, and then get into some kind of an action. And we do live in an age where everybody is very informed, everybody has all the knowledge, but I'm not sure everybody takes action on the insights they have. So what I would love to know and unpack from all of you, what does agency mean for each of you? And maybe, Vivek, you can start with that.
Yeah, it's such a powerful concept. And over the last couple of years, as I have been working with Lightspeed Ventures, and that's one of the core values I've learned, from the firm. From a definitional perspective, if you go back to the roots of what agency is, the Latin word, I think, stands for something around to act, to do, or to drive. And a lot of psychologists and sociologists talk about two basic principles about agency. One is the ability to act independently, either within or outside of social structures. And the second is this idea of self-efficacy, which is inherently you believe that you have the capacity to influence outcomes. So a lot of, I think, agency starts with acting with intention. Number two is asserting with autonomy. And then the third is being able to own your own choices to be able to influence outcomes. And just to give you an example about, Lightspeed Ventures, Betel Somaya, who used to be the head of Lightspeed India, was then asked to go to San Francisco to the Lightspeed global headquarters to take on the global role for Lightspeed. And a lot of what he began advocating was creating a very distributed leadership model for the India team. And some of the things that, the principles we talked about agency were, number one, must find a way out, right? Number two, obviously, is bias for action. The third big principle was just take the extra step. The fourth principle was be truth-seeking. The fifth was actually having insatiable curiosity. And then the final was having intellectual humility. Right? So if you kind of combine these things together, you talked about, Jaya, about empowerment, about ownership. But if you peel the onion, it actually is a very, very powerful concept in terms of, how we can all end up guiding, our actions. And to me, agency is far more about behaviors, right? It's not about intention. It's far more about behaviors.
So, I'd like all of you to weigh in on this. What are some things that people who are just starting their careers out or are the mid-career level, in terms of exercising agency? And have you seen examples of that with the people that you've worked with?
Sure. So for me, agency is a take, I think, on what Vivek said, which is more creation and less consumption, right? We all live in a world where it's so easy to watch a good podcast or a reel and hit like.
I love that line, More creation, less consumption, right? So
exactly. And it's that much harder to create good content and put yourself out there, right? So in my mind, in a way, that's the difference. And all the high agency people I know, honestly, they are builders. They spend most of their time building, creating, thinking, making. Because I've realized the more you build, the more you feel like you're writing your own story.
But
right?
Shalini, let me just ask you, when you're somebody who's just starting out or, is in a big organization, how does one exercise that?
Right. So what I'd like to say is that the good news is that agency is not about leadership positions or formal authority, right? Mm-hmm. So you can be a fairly junior person and do these few things. I'd like to add a few examples. So firstly, you don't focus on what's wrong, but how can you change it? Right? And that can be in the smallest possible way. You can own what you can, right? So step number one, don't focus on problems, focus on finding the solution, right? That's a big one. Secondly, don't focus on organizational constraints, but how you can navigate it. Because organizations are all going to have their set of problems, their bureaucracy, red tape, and yet you need to find your way around it. So if you can, that's a great way to build agency. Right? The other things you can do is that you can take ownership. It could be in very small but meaningful ways. For example, you can own a process, right? You spot an inefficiency and you step up and suggest a solution. Don't wait for someone senior to do it, right? You're given a task, own the outcome. Don't just perform the task, but see how you can influence a better result. Own the communication, right? So don't assume that everyone knows what you're doing. Go out there and talk about it. So if you can take a lead on a lot of these things, you automatically create a space for yourself and create agency. I think the fourth point that really comes to mind is influence. Influence is not really linked to a position of authority, right? So find your champions, your cheerleaders, your allies, and through them you can push your agendas forward, right? So I think that's another great way that irrespective of seniority, you can navigate a large workplace. And lastly, I would say, ask for opportunities. I find a lot of young people don't come forward and ask for something more. So I genuinely believe if you put your hand up and you want to take more ownership, you can have these conversations with leadership. So ask for more, fulfill those responsibilities. So if you take the lead, I think the sky is the limit. And these are the people I know as a leader that I would certainly, put on the fast track. And certainly give them more and more. And if they do a great job, I mean, sky's the limit. So that's my little bit on it.
Shalini's, I think, laid out some great ideas in terms of, I think, ownership, solutions, influencing. I think another important part of this, building on what you were saying, Shalini, is this whole idea of going the extra mile. See, very few times when you have a meeting with a team member, very few times people actually say, what else can I do for you? Right? That simple act of someone in the meeting saying, hey,
Stepping up.
Can I step up? What else can I actually do for you? And the second very important part about agency also is actually asking for feedback. Most of us wait to get feedback at the end of an appraisal
we're
cycle.
scared.
We're scared and it's too late, right? But the simple idea of being able to actually ask for feedback, because if we don't know what do we need to do differently to grow, it's very difficult to be able to exercise agency.
I like what both of you said, just one line.
Yeah.
I think be part of the solution.
Yeah.
I think that, most time people just are very scared. I think between courage and wanting to be part of a solution can have a very huge impact. Can I raise my hand and can I offer a solution right now? Yeah.
And actually, Vivek, which brings me to your book. You've got lots of great examples in this great new book that you've written, along with Sundar Ramachandran. And I remember one distinct example where I think two people who were in the same department were having a little bit of a struggle with each other. They weren't really getting along. I think one person was there was a little bit of one-upmanship going on. Yeah. But the other person actually, when that one person was struggling, was sort of stepped up and tried to help. And that actually bridged that struggle, internal struggle. So I would love to, share another example of something that you've shared in the book about where agency has really helped somebody at that junior to mid-level sort of succeed in an organization.
No, I think, across the book, a lot of the chapters talk about this idea of micro habits, right? And I think, Gayatri, as you were saying, the ability to actually be vulnerable and ask for help. We all try to be superheroes, right? And I've also gone through this, and I talk in the book about, waiting till very late with a project that I was working on. And I was a little bit nervous about admitting to my boss at that time that I didn't really know how to really solve that problem. And in the end, he had to jump in and work till late nights. And I realized, look, it's so important to know when to ask for help and how to ask for help. And then when someone comes to you, please be very generous in giving help as well. So one of the first companies I worked with was Bain & Company. And one of Bain's mantras we talk about is, Bainey never lets another fellow Bainey down. Which means that even if someone calls you at 2 in the morning, you wake up and help that person. And so this idea of having each other's back is also a great way to start, exercising agency, because ultimately none of us work in isolation. And if you're working in a team, the importance of connection, the importance of looking out for each other, the importance of appreciation, those are also things we normally don't talk about, because we think life is a zero-sum game, that if I win, then somebody else will end up losing. But if you truly believe in this idea of an infinite game, I think there's enough opportunity for everybody else to keep on growing and thriving.
Right. Jaya, have you had an example of where looking back on your career, where you actually exercised agency to your benefit?
I think early in my career, not so much. I think becoming a leadership coach and then starting WLC, I think, has been about co-creation. One of the biggest things, the reason we are here today, has been because getting so many people together from different walks of life and then co-creating something and dividing all the spotlight you get as a founder. I do believe that it's not for me to build something alone. And sometimes founders and leaders can get a little self-obsessed that this is and I think if you can divide and co-create something, the impact is also many folds. Yeah, and I think that's happened in the last 15 months.
To me, I think, Gayatri, you, Shalini, this is a wonderful example of agency, right? Because a lot of what WC is all about, it's not about individual success, it's not about ego. It's in this passion for a joint mission, and all of you are coming together to try and create something which is quite extraordinary in many ways. And so to me, I see this as a great example of so many people coming together to exercise agency.
I just finished Graydon Carter's book, and he was the longtime editor of Vanity Fair, and of course now has Airmail Weekly. And in that he spoke, we can think journalism is totally devoid from, business or in the corporate world, but actually a journalist or reporter is only as good as their editor. So you can, get the best information, but unless that information is packaged in order to be digested for an audience, and who can do that but a really strong editor, or for that matter a book, it's not going to your point, influence, being able to and share share that communication, it's not going to work. So actually this parallel of, the word agency can be applied through all facets of our lives.
Yes. And to that, I would love to ask an example. You've mentored many people, and I know you run a large organization. Have you seen any difference in people who kind of display this kind of collaborative agency again and again versus sometimes people who kind of just miss the mark? Any examples? Of course, no names, but yeah.
No, I think this is a muscle.
True.
I don't think it's necessarily something which it's not as if you're born with high agency and
You're
less,
well
less
said. I agree with
agency,
you.
right?
Yeah.
This is a bit of a muscle that develops, and I've seen young interns, I've seen folks in customer service who will go above and beyond the call of duty just to make things happen. They will not feel like victims. They'll come up with some great ideas. It's important for the organization to be able to do, I think, three things. One is, without clarity, it's very difficult to have an agency-driven culture. If people are not clear on what they're going to do and what the expectations are, then it gets very difficult. The second important point is autonomy, right? You want people to feel empowered, you want people to feel responsible. And without autonomy, very difficult to have a culture with high agency. The third is support. Are you actually trusting people? Is there enough psychological safety? When people need help, when people want to experiment, can they ask for help? Will you tolerate mistakes? It's very important, because if people are not feeling safe that they can actually make mistakes, very difficult for anyone to learn agency. Just then keeping quiet and said, this is not my problem, let me just delegate this upwards, right? So those are very important enabling conditions that once you have them, I think it's possible for anybody to learn how to exercise agency.
I was reading about this two-door policy in Amazon. There, if somebody young came in and came with an idea or innovation, saying no was harder than saying yes. You had to make a long case study to say no. So most seniors, out of not wanting to do that level of paperwork, and if the consequences were not so bad, were allowed to say, you said it and said yes. And actually, AWS, which is their 75% of revenue that comes from cloud computing at AWS, is because somebody just didn't have the heart
To say no, they didn't want to do the paperwork.
Absolutely. So I think this is this is a clear action of agencies supported at leadership, that we're going to make it really hard for you to say no.
So I have a question for Shalini, actually, because you've advised so many multi-generational families, entrepreneurs, etc. And obviously we have a traditional setup for the most part in India. How do sort of the next generation in a situation like that exercise their agency? And can you give us examples of that?
Sure. So that's a good question. I was reading this interesting statistic which said that only 30% of family businesses survive the first generation. And by the time you get to the fourth generation, that number is just 3%. Which means that while traditions and value systems are good, family businesses need to pivot as well. And that's where today I'm seeing a lot of the second generation who are going off to study, do really cool things, coming back, but with very fresh ideas on where they see their family business. At times, it's not even related to what the family does. So 2 or 3 trends that I'm seeing there. One is large families today, the patriarchs are getting in advisors to professionalize the businesses, right? Because they do not automatically assume their kids are going to want the business. So that's a big part of what's happening, on the family office side. The other thing is there are, I met a family the other day and they always tell us these are our big financial goals. We want these sums of money at various stages of our kids' lives. This founder had fairly young kids and he's mentioned a fairly large number, triple digit in crores, saying that for each of my kids, I want this to be ready by the time they're 25. So I was like, is it for further education? Is it for like a fancy marriage? What's it about? He said, no, this is their startup kitty for each of them.
Wow, nice kitty, huh?
Yeah. How many kids do they have, by the way?
Fortunately, just 2. But the point is that even the traditional businesses today are recognizing that it's a whole new world and the youngsters are looking at, renewable energy, AI, tech-led stuff. So clearly, there's no assumption anymore that yes, values are important, but I think the businesses can completely pivot into something else altogether. And families are really supporting that. So that's pretty interesting. So the youngsters have agency, they can decide the next way forward.
You've written in your book a lot about the mindset and tools that are required to build success early in your career. I would love to know from your own personal journeys, the kind of pivots you had that created the anchoring principles that you've highlighted in your book. Yeah.
Jaya, one of the central themes about the book, which we sometimes forget, is that a career for most of us will actually last for 40 plus years. But that's the reality, right? And so obviously all of us tend to really obsess about the short-term promotion, the short-term raise, the short-term review. But if you put it in perspective, I think a few years here or there honestly does not make a difference. But as we discuss in the book, if you are going to think about a career in terms of 40 plus years, for most of us, careers will go through multiple phases. So I had about an 11 or 12-year phase as a consultant. I had about an 11-year phase running a very large company. And over the last 6-7 years, it's been about actually working in the world of startups. One is in an operating role, and now being able to enable founders and actually move more into a mentoring role. So I think as we look at careers, it's so important to figure out and recognize that all of our careers will actually go through multiple phases. And also what's interesting is that success isn't a continuous journey either, right? There will be different phases of or different definitions of success as you go through these multiple phases. And we were talking about your love for art, and painting. And I just remembered, this analogy of, your career being a bit of your canvas, right? Which you have to paint, right? Sometimes you'll have some bold strokes. Sometimes you'll have some subtle strokes. The texture will change, etc. So if you think about careers as a canvas, I think just given your passion for painting, it can be a very powerful analogy in terms of how we think about painting the career of our lives.
True.
Shalini, what about you? Have you had multiple pivots?
I have. So I think the one thing that's really stood me in good stead is that I think about risk to career very differently, and I'll explain what I mean. I interview so many people, right? And they always say, oh, it's a boutique firm, and I'm not sure that I can take this risk at this stage of the career. And I've always believed that real growth, both financially as well as in terms of me as a professional, has always happened when I've really taken the road less traveled. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I've not even thought about it as a risk, because what really happens is that once you have confidence in your abilities, you know that if something doesn't work, you can always come back to mainstream. So how is it a risk if you have a safety net? And of course, you yourself are your safety net. But the point is that that's allowed me to take decisions which to the outside world might have sounded insane, going from huge firms to small boutiques, starting new business lines, so in a way being a startup founder in a much larger firm, but picking up something that I knew would challenge me and I'd be able to add value, which I think would then get rewarded in various ways. So I think picking that difficult task or role, knowing that I had the safety net of my skill set to fall back on, has allowed me to do some pretty crazy things, I think, by any standards. So maybe largely in the same industry, but the kind of places I've worked and the things I've done have certainly made me, I think, the professional I am today. And I wouldn't give up any of those, bits of my career over the years.
So the road less traveled, which I think, Jaya, you know a little bit about.
Yes, yes, of course. And in fact, looking at my own pivots, multiple pivots, I think something, one framework very beautifully articulated by Vivek in one of our learning events was scaling self, scaling teams, and scaling business. So to me, I think when I took a break from my career and kind of started working on being a leadership coach is really not about helping others, but helping yourself. And to me, the scaling self really helped me when I went inward to understand who I am, what is my purpose, what's the impact I want to have in the world. I got really aligned to where I wanted to be next. And then you can, of course, scale your team, scale your businesses. But I think the first journey starts with really your inward conversation. And I think that has given me the most agency, getting to know myself in the last decade.
And as you were going through this, was there any apprehensions you were feeling, and how did you deal with those?
I think for me, a lot of work had already happened. 2008, I remember. I can never forget that moment in September, October. I think I was separating from my husband then, and my EMI was equal to my salary. And overnight, Citibank was getting bailed out. And I remember talking to my best friend, I don't think so we'll have a job tomorrow morning. I think once you go through that, you lose a lot of fear around what's the worst that can happen. So once you get very comfortable with kind of constantly letting go of fear and just working with courage, as beautifully articulated by Shalini, that constantly recheck your fear. And also one thing we do is we constantly kind of build a worst case scenario. We first jump to what's the worst that can happen. And I think if you kind of just reimagine a middle case, things are not so bad.
So I think those of us who are schooled in the art of the spreadsheet, right? You have the base case, you have the worst, and then you have the upside. And it's human tendency to go towards the worst because that's just how we all are sort of conditioned to think. But I think that, to your point about really understanding yourself, and I think Shalini and Vivek, both of you also mentioned that, I think that is so important because I also had a career in the corporate world, but totally pivoted because I just realized that my love for language triumphed everything else. And maybe one day, Vivek, we will also see you make that leap to becoming a scriptwriter, which seems to be your secret.
Yes, I'm waiting. And I do think Bollywood needs you scriptwriters.
So, but I think, to this point, you both are in, a world where you're constantly meeting dynamic people, lots of talent, coming across the spectrum, whether they're young at the younger level or, senior. What is it that you look for when it comes to talent and when you're doing your own hiring decisions?
So agency is really core to so many of these things, and I think there's so many aspects and perspectives there, but it all starts with really self-awareness, I would say. So do people have self-awareness, and do I believe they can self-regulate? Because the last thing you want is really to have to constantly write someone to get the job done, right? So that's such an important aspect.
But how do you look for that, Shalini, when where you're meeting somebody through the interview process and all that? Because those are things that you learn about someone over time, right?
So there are always a few signs, when you talk to people, and they reveal a bit about themselves in terms of what they've done in the previous job, right? And when they do point out, say, failures, for example, or things they could have done better, you realize that they are looking inwards and they are being fairly vulnerable, and they're sharing not just their strengths with you, but also what hasn't gone well. So I always give a lot of extra credit to people who are very self-aware. And you do ask a lot of interview questions as to what do you think you could do better, offered this role, and so on and so forth. So I think language, communication, a lot of these that are revealing tells, I would say, which allow you to judge that. And I think goal orientation in our business, it's all about numbers. So the minute people talk about what they've done in terms of business achievements, I think it's pretty clear that they have this very deep drive to succeed. And I think that ambition is what makes people self-starters. So to be able to see that initiative, not wait for opportunities, want to grab, what you see out there and take charge. I think that's really amazing. And then you look for far more softer aspects. Obviously, technical skills, all of that is there. But what are their values? What is it that they're looking for? Why are they leaving firm X to come to firm Y, right? What made them unhappy there? So what drives them? What motivates them? Will they be a team player? Will they be able to fit into the culture of your organization? Do you see leadership capability? Do you think they'll be able to scale? Do you think they'll be able to, does their EQ, support the aspirations we have for that person, especially if it's at a leadership role? So I think there are just so many things. Some of it is technical, or are you client-centric, all of that. But on the other hand, it's more about the softer aspects, because I genuinely believe, and Vivek, I'm sure you've seen this too, is that there's so many things you can teach people, but there are a lot of intrinsic characteristics which are innate. You cannot teach. And I think that's where you really need to use that 1 or 2 hours that you get to be able to assess what really makes someone tick. And is that the gap you're looking to fill in your organization with this person? So I think those softer skills and, those innate characteristics is what I try and, assess when I'm looking for people.
I just want to add to one thing, which I think she does very well, and I'm sure Vivek does very well, is your own intuition. You start honing on people. After 20, 30 years of meeting people, you start getting a gut around who will work and who not works. So while all this works, but you also start feeling an energy, you start seeing how they're bullshitting or actually they have values aligned to you. So I think that really, to me, within the first 20 minutes of an interview, you can feel that person will work or not. That
energy is so important, right? Yes. Because the energy filter. I just met someone today, in fact, a young girl, must be in her 20s. And I was like, oh my God, she fills the room, right. And I'm like, I wouldn't mind giving her a job, though I'd expect this for a, say, 10, 15-year kind of a work ex, because I'm like, she will inherit that position. She'll step into it, So I think that's energy, that's positive, a gut feel, as you said. I think that's very true.
Vivek?
Yeah, I think Shalini and Jaya have laid out a very, very comprehensive framework. Just a couple of things I could add. One is I've learned over time that no one is perfect, right? So what I look for is spikes, right? One or two real areas where the person is far better than the average. Because generally in life, what drives superior performance are those one or two, things where you are better than anybody else head and shoulder, right? So one is, what are those spikes? The second question I actually love asking in interviews is, what are you not good at? And then getting far deeper into the person saying, look, give us maybe some examples when you were not good at something. How did you deal with it? It tells you so much more about a person because everyone is in sell mode in an interview. So when you start asking that question, you get to know how humble the person is, how self-aware it is, how they, embrace mistakes and go with it. The third thing is, over time, I realized that we have so many of our own biases as far as interviewing is concerned. So I've learned to rely far more on references than my own interviewing skills. Right? So I'll interview, but honestly, I'll spend almost 3 or 4x the time actually doing much more detailed references from if the person's a manager, who their reportees, their bosses, their peers, and getting a much more integrated view. At least we've realized, when at Lightspeed also, that references are a far better indicator of performance and success than perhaps our own interviewing skills.
You're right, 75% of jobs come through networks. Actually, it's not through college placements, not through just giving your CVs. 75% happens through networking.
You brought up the point about biases. And Jaya wanted us to ask some controversial questions. So do you have a gender bias? Do you compensate for gender when do you look for more women, for example, when you're recruiting?
I think one of the great blessings of being a woman is that you actually don't see gender because you've always been the gender probably that's been maybe looked at through that lens. But when I interview, I really do look for the best fit for the job. So somewhere I feel with time, gender is not a bias. There could be many others, I'm sure, like any human person, but I don't find that to be a problem. In fact, my team, both at a leadership level and down the line, we have a fairly large representation of women. So I don't know if that's a subconscious byproduct of bias, but I'm pretty sure it's really, the best man for the job. I also do one more thing actively to avoid bias. I always ensure a second or third pair of eyes on the person. Absolutely. Right? So we didn't even have a head of HR till recently. So the first thing I did was hire a head of HR. I'm like, I need a fresh set of eyes on, everybody we bring in because I really want my biases to be neutralized, by someone else. So that's really worked for me to have a sounding board and to ensure that my, lens does not color my decision too much.
Right. What about you, Vivek? I know you're very much an advocate for, women in the workplace. So do you have a bias that goes, skews a little bit towards women?
No, this is a journey, I think, Gayatri, right? And I'm sure all of us have so many unconscious biases and we try and, as we get more awareness, we try and do something about it, right? But in terms of gender, again, it's been a journey. And I sometimes feel like in the past, many years ago, when we were trying to recruit more women in sales or in factories, right? There were so many reasons not to hire women for what seemed like, ostensibly very valid reasons. And in hindsight, I don't think I pushed hard enough. I took it as face value, tried to justify and say, you must be true, right? And I remember even for recruiting, one of the big changes we made at that time was we said, like, whenever we see a shortlist, at least out of 3 people in the final shortlist, one has to be a woman. The question is, why not 2 out of 4? Why 1 out of 3, right? And then we even give an extra incentive to the search firms to surface, women candidates, which led to a lot of positive change happen. But I feel like in hindsight, sometimes I settled for the status quo, right, and did not push hard enough in the beginning, because each time people came up with excuses, I tried to be reasonable. And sometimes as a leader, you have to be unreasonable also when you believe something is right. And so I think that's the bias I think I've learned over time to address now.
So, of course, now you're in an industry which is very sort of gender skewed, right? Private equity just does not have that many women. So, are you seeing changes there too, at least within the context of India?
It's been gradual. And so again, within Lightspeed, out of 6 partners, 2 are women. So it's not a bad starting place to be in. But this is a funnel problem, right? So unless you have enough folks, at the entry levels coming through, staying on, and to me, I think, parachuting and trying to find too many senior women in these ranks is not feasible. I think the industry is mindful for it, and where I feel positive about change is there are so many women founders who are coming in. Jaya is an example here, right? So the more you have women founders, a lot of those founders, may decide to become investors over time, or increasingly, I think the more founders you have, you'll start seeing a lot more change actually happen. But you're right, so far the change has been painfully slow, and I'm really hoping we start seeing some meaningful changes happen. And I'm hoping that Lightspeed actually leads the way in this.
I'm sure this is true for you all as well, but in a room of 10, I'm usually just the only woman. So, when we're in meetings and boardrooms, it's honestly just me and maybe 9 other guys. So
I've been lucky. In our room, we're all 10 women. So we've been
but that's an outlier. But Vivek talked about this funnel problem. And of course, we're talking about talent and what you look for. But one of the big dinosaurs in the room is AI and automation of jobs. And, the data is pretty alarming in terms of just the number of jobs that we could be losing as the world adopts all these technologies. 12 million educated people are unemployed every year in this country alone. And so, what do you tell young people about this, when we're trying to address this funnel problem, and young women and men, of course, when the traditional ladder as we know it is broken or crumbling?
So interestingly, I heard Bill Gates speak in Bombay recently, and we were talking about AI. And he started by saying something that sounded so elitist while talking about AI and job displacement. He said, human beings were not meant for jobs. They were not meant to do jobs. I was just thinking it's easy when you're a billionaire, you don't need to work, so no problem. But when I thought about it, what he really meant to say is that the routine jobs, which are so standard, which are so mechanical, it kills human endeavor. And people were not meant to do these absolutely baseline, Excel sheet. You said you would write a 100-page research report. How long would it take you?
A few months.
Few months, right? AI can, after a management call, kind of in 2 minutes spew out the analysis.
No.
They can.
I know.
So the point is that a lot of these routine tasks which will get replaced. But what I think the big way forward, and what Bill Gates was also trying to say, is that AI will complement human endeavor in a way that will allow us space to do things which combine skills, of course, but with creativity. So the world as we know it will change, but I don't believe that it will eliminate human endeavor of various sorts. So definitely reskilling, upskilling, learning new things. AI, like you said, is already being taught in various places. So I think what we do will change, but it'll certainly not eliminate the need for human beings, right? So I think from that perspective, people now getting into the workforce will have to think very differently about careers, just the way we've had to think about it, because when I was finishing college, you could either be a doctor, engineer, or one of maybe 3 things. Yeah. And today, sky's the limit. So I think the human mind has not evolved sufficiently to even be able to foresee this change. So I don't worry about people losing jobs. We'll just have to look at things very differently, and we'll have to learn very different skill sets. That's what I genuinely believe. So one will really need to be at the cutting edge of how things are evolving.
There's a World Economic Forum report which says 60% of jobs will need to be reskilled. We're going to create 170 million new jobs, and 92 million jobs will get disrupted. So there's still a net positive number. What I'd like to know from you, Vivek, is that to remain relevant, there's AI, there's green jobs that are coming our way, a lot of sustainability-based jobs, autonomous cars, a lot of this is coming our way. But how do you stay relevant in a world which is changing faster than you can keep up with it?
And completely echo, and I really hope that I'm very optimistic as well that over time, having people focus less on routine tasks may unleash a huge wave of creativity and imagination in the world. In the near term, though, I think the impact will be gut-wrenching. Maybe 100 million jobs will get created, but those 90 will get lost far, far quicker. All right, and you are seeing this in terms of the kind of hiring declines that the IT sector has been doing. Tomorrow, if you're starting a new factory, rather than perhaps 1,000 workers, you might only need 100, right? So in the near term, I see the impact on jobs, job losses actually being very significant. And over time, I think, as we've seen with the advent of the computer and the internet, hope it'll lead to newer ideas and newer creativity. So I'm very hopeful of that. But in the short term, I think the effect could be actually far, far deeper than what any of us are imagining. And you can already start seeing some indicators towards that direction.
There's a famous saying, what gets you here doesn't get you there. And I'm sure there's been your own mid-career slump that you went through, or we all get stuck somewhere. And the person who gets stuck is ourselves. And we sometimes blame the organization or the culture, our bosses. So I'd love to know from your own journey and all of our journeys that how did you unstuck yourself? What it took to kind of say that, okay, this is not other people's problem, this is my problem.
No, after many years in consulting, I was getting promoted quite fast from a consultant to becoming a manager to becoming a partner. And what I realized was I was actually a fairly good manager and I really enjoyed that part of the job. But in terms of, again, becoming a senior partner, I was trying to employ the same skill sets which I was good at, in terms of continuing to go that way. And then one day I realized, look, I did not really want to be a senior partner and I wouldn't be good at it either, right? And I think that recognition of looking within yourself and figuring out what you're good at and what gives you meaning and enjoyment. I think once that realization came through, the Godrej opportunity came in, which allowed me to reinvent myself and develop a different kind of different kinds of muscles and all. And so I think, Jaya, in all of our journeys, we all get caught up in this performance treadmill. Sometimes it's important to just reflect a little bit on these two questions. What am I good at? And what's giving me meaning? And if you do that, in an honest manner, the right answers will emerge.
And Shalini, what about you? Did you ever go through a career slump?
When I look back, I think there was this phase in my career where I kept repeating this pattern that I kept going back to work with people who I'd worked for before, right? So anytime they'd want to do something new, so while I loved the fact that they thought of me to do something new and difficult, I realized I wasn't choosing the jobs for the right reasons. And somewhere then I had to step back, think about what I was doing. And so now at 52, I'm really in the last, hurrah, so to speak, and wanted to land somewhere very meaningful where I'll be able to probably do the next 7-10 years of my life, right? So that's when I really had to look at everything with very fresh eyes, put all of that. I don't know why you call it comfort, because every time you start something new, it's like a whole, crazy startup life.
Exactly.
But I kept going back multiple times just to work with people who called because we've worked together before. And I recognized that, I had to break that cycle. And that's when I kind of stepped off that treadmill, really examined what do I want to do with the last probably 10 years of my career. And then I felt I've made a meaningful choice. So I think that's how I broke that pattern for myself.
So the only exception I would take to what you said is this is not the last hurrah. You're only 52.
You're just starting.
I love being in this room where everyone makes you feel fairly young. So I love that.
So you will be seeing me and Gayatri hopefully in Italy. She'll be landscaping and I'll be painting.
And she'll be the interior designer for the house. And we will give Vivek a room to write his script.
Remember the 40-50-year marathon? So,
So yeah, 30 years done, another 10 at least to go, I think.
But we spoke about, both of you spoke about what you look for in talent, and of course we spoke about this tension and anxiety around automation and the advent of artificial intelligence, and all the skills and the qualities that both of you sort of pointed out are what we would call softer skills. And it's interesting because in a country like India, where we emphasize STEM careers and the study of STEM subjects so deeply, at the expense of humanities, I might add, because studying the humanities seem to be a sort of a dead end, no job, kind of a light at the end of the tunnel kind of situation. How do you kind of take those two disparities, this kind of conundrum, where you do need to have the humanities to develop the softer skills in communications, empathy, etc., with this crazy focus on a STEM-driven society?
The two subjects I think that should be mandatory right from school, one is communication and one is psychology. Because I think everything you do, no matter what discipline you practice in the rest of your career, these will be the two underlying, I would say, skills that will elevate everything you do. Everything is about human connection at the end of the day, right? If you don't want to be irrelevant in an AI world, I think it's our human connections that are going to really see us through successful careers. And if you need to understand people, whether you're in sales, whether you're in research, whether you're whatever that each of us does, I think to be able to communicate and be able to put your thoughts into words, I think that's so important to build connections. And secondly, to be able to understand how the other person thinks. And to some extent, this points to the EQ aspect as well. To be able to empathize, to be able to put yourself in another person's shoes. Psychology seems like such an important, subject to study. So,
but if you got a psychology resume, a person who studied that, or communications, would you give them that interview?
Absolutely. So for a sales role, I don't care what you've studied, because I can teach you how to, read a stock report. I can teach you so many things. But if you can speak, you can communicate your thought process, I would most certainly give them a shot.
In fact, I think Warren Buffett talks about it at the very early age of in 2021, he went and took a communication workshop. And that's the first thing. He doesn't talk about developing wealth management as a skill. He talks about developing self-awareness, ability to witness when markets really go volatile, to be able to step back constantly and manage yourself. And the communication is a very big thing, even as an investor who's such a big investor talks about. Yeah.
In one of the blog posts I'm writing for my newsletter, Monday 8 a.m., it'll come out, I think, maybe this week or in a couple of weeks, is this idea that please don't call them soft skills, right? These are structural skills. These are actually structural, call it structural or foundation, but I think we do a disservice by actually calling them soft skills. And Gayatri, you and I both have been products of liberal arts education, right? So we can appreciate this importance of integrated problem solving. To solve any difficult problem, you have to learn how to connect the dots. And connecting the dots requires understanding the technical aspects, understanding how to sell change, how to communicate, how to market. And so I think while the STEM curriculum is very good to develop technical skills, for us to become more holistic and integrative problem solvers, reading fiction, reading non-fiction is probably more important than reading books like Head Start, right? So they were important books, but I always tell, even tell myself, look, I should be reading much more books about history and fiction. And I wish, I would end up doing that a lot more, I think.
But do you think the recruiting process in India and in corporate India reflects what the two of you are? Are you both, you might be outliers, but it doesn't seem as though this is really the norm.
It's very broken. The recruiting process is unfortunately very broken because you're looking for ready folks who'll be productive on day one, as opposed to thinking on what drives long-term success. So we ends up optimizing, for the near term. Yes. And it's a filtering criteria, right? When you have a population with so many thousands of people available, having a stamp of an IIT unfortunately becomes just the way to filter and screen candidates. Unfortunate, but that's a reality, I think, in terms of just having far too much supply. And so I think the lazy approach is to go to an IIT and get people from there, I think. And it's hopefully it's changing. I've been associated with Ashoka University, and they're trying. I think they're trying to bring in a different way of, I think, coaching and training and developing people, I think, yeah.
So, there is always that one thing we look in people as a spark. And what is the one trait you see in entrepreneurs or founders as a very effective trait? And I know, Vivek, you've mentored so many founders. And I know, Shalini, you manage so many family offices. Would love to know that one thing you see in founders that makes them very effective.
For me, it's very simply a very strong conviction with adaptability. Right? Because you need to have a very strong point of view. You need to have a very strong vision in terms of what problem you are solving, why do you think you can solve it better than anybody else. But at the same time, you need to have the humility and the courage to actually also pivot as the situation demands and be adaptable.
Well said.
For me, the one thing would be if the person can, I'm sure we've all read the book which says start with why, right? Simon Sinek, which basically says that the answer that a founder needs to be able to reflect is why is he doing what he's doing? The how, the what, everything follows. Whereas most people work outwards, if you think of it as concentric circles, right? And for me, if there is clarity on that, which will show his vision, which will show his values, how is he aligned to what he wants to do, I think if...
And her vision and her values also.
I was also going in my brain. I was thinking the same thing.
So I think that's the short answer. If the founder can tell me, if he can tell me the why, I know that he'll be able to probably make everything else work.
I think we have two T-shirts. One is conviction and adaptability, and the other is why.
I would add that to all of the summaries that I think something Leena Nair said when she made a pivot to Chanel. She said the human being aspect will trump the human doing aspect. And I think we're really getting into this age of human being aspect.
Very powerful.
Yeah.
Which is a lovely way to sum up our entire episode, which was really about agency. That's how we started, and that's exactly what it's about: the individual and what the individual is able to act upon based on the environment that he or she is functioning in.
So, as you guys know, I'm a movie buff. So, I would love to know a good movie you can recommend to our viewers. Something that you really like the movie, or something you learned from.
I would strongly recommend the Star Wars franchise. It seems so out there, but it was entertainment. It was so many metaphors. It took you out of this world. And I think for movies, that for me is a big stress buster, because I always think about what's going to take me out of my day-to-day life and out of the real world. So that's it for me.
Wow, so many choices. Shawshank Redemption,
Amazing.
The Pursuit of Happiness, even Three Idiots. I've seen that movie so many, Rancho and everything, so many times actually. Yeah.
I'll go back to the past. There's a movie called What's Up Doc with Barbara Streisand and Robert Redford. It is so funny. And every time I see it, I'm always laughing. And it's a movie that actually, I think it came out in the 60s. So you must watch it just to get a laugh. And given the world we live in, it's good to laugh.
Oh, I agree with you. So she covered my favorite franchise. So I'm going to do the next Marvel movie, Doctor Strange. Yeah. The first Doctor Strange has a lot of metaphors, and there's a very nice line there. You're seeing the world through a keyhole. Yes. And he goes to a Nepal monastery when his teacher teaches him to bend time, and she says that you're seeing the world through a keyhole.
Amazing.
A book you have recently read and would recommend?
For me, it would be Start With Why, because I absolutely love the philosophy. It's also, I think, the third most watched TED Talk in the world for those who don't like to read. But I think it really clarifies for everybody what really should make you tick. What is that one thing that you live for? And if you can answer that, I think life will have a lot of meaning. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I love Simon Sinek as well. For me, it's not recent, but the book which I've loved reading is called The Goal by Ellie Goldratt. It actually talks about the theory of constraints, right? In a factory that's gone haywire. And how do you have to find a way to debottleneck wherever the constraints are? And the TOC or theory of constraints has become one of the biggest things in terms of solving problems. And so I always go back to a very a technical concept taught in a very interesting story-like manner. So that's the one book I found very memorable.
It's a book I never talk about, but it's something I recommend to many of my clients. It's the Vedanta Treatise. And it really teaches you about the way of life, and it debunks karma as positive affirmative action, which is agency. And I think it should be taught in schools. And unfortunately, we have a Japanese book called Ikigai, which is oversimplified the Vedanta Treatise. So that's one of my favorite books.
Fascinating that you linked agency to karma as
Yeah,
well, right?
I know.
So I love that, Jaya.
Deep thoughts, very philosophical. I recently completed Keith McNally's I Regret Almost Everything. I love memoirs, and he was, of course, one of New York's nightlife impresarios, running some of the most famous restaurants, including Balthazar, Pastis, etc. And he started the book opening by saying how he was basically his family found him after he tried to commit suicide after a stroke. So from that to just talking about his life is very, very moving, extremely well written, and I would highly recommend it. The most exciting thing is that Keith and I now follow each other on Instagram, and we had a DM exchange. And I was like, wow.
That's the high part. That's the high moment. Yeah, when you get lovely.
Exciting.
Yeah, who do I want to DM? Okay. I know.